So yeah, hello everybody. Yeah, this is I'm an artist, and when I'm in bigger groups like that, I get always very shy. I know, okay, this is my opportunity to meet this guy from this festival, that director, to present myself. But at the end, I'm always at the table with the technicians, and I don't speak to them. So this session for me, when they asked me to collaborate, I was thinking, okay, what is really important for me, for artists? And I think that these 3 days are really can create meaningful encounters, that you get the opportunity to speak with somebody. And so I thought it might be much easier if you sit at the same table with him to start this conversation. So we made for every day another seating order, that you get the chance to meet in these mornings 7 people, 7 people, 7 people. That's quite a lot. And the other stuff we're doing now is the same idea. I want now to give the word to 8 different presenters. And so you all can listen to them and are kindly invited then to use the coffee break or whatever to approach them, that it might be easier than it is normally for me. And so what we are doing now is very new for me, because normally I like to do long-term projects and I like to have a lot of time. My conversations last for hours, and now I have to do the other thing. We have 6 to 7 minutes for everybody, so it will be kind of speed dating format, and we start with you, so let's do it. So you know what to start?
I start right away?
Yeah.
Oh dear. Hello, everybody. So my name is Naomi Fall, and I am here to present quite quickly, indeed, the Farifoni Wati. So I forgot my notebook, but I know it because it's me. So I moved to Bamako in 2010, just to give you a brief history. Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm not sure I need it, but it's for safety reasons, yeah. I moved to Bamako in 2010. I'm a dancer and choreographer, and I moved to Bamako, and very quickly I was like, okay, if I want to stay here, I like and love being here, and if I want to do that, then let's make things happen, you know? So I very quickly started a dance company, and then a space and everything, and so 8 years, actually 6 years later, I decided to do a condensed version of what I've been doing in Mali the whole time. So workshops, creative work, touring in villages, outdoors, indoors. So working on audience relationships with the audience, relationship to creation, and all of that, and doing a condensed version of this in a festival. So that's how I came to the Farifoni Wati. And so the concept of this event is there's a group of dancers, 15 to 20, depending on the money we get, of dancers, and then we invite 3 choreographers, and everybody meets for 2 days, and then the choreographers kind of choose dancers that they want to work with, and then they have 2.5 weeks to make a short new piece that is then presenting during the weekend of the festival. And so, as you can see, in that weekend, those pieces are presented, but also other things. And we usually start in the afternoon outdoors, and we present contemporary dance, traditional dance, urban dance, puppeteers, many things outdoors, and then we kind of move in to the theater. And then those little short pieces, which I think are called FFW Plateau, I know they're called that, are presented along with a piece from the choreographer's repertoire for a weekend. And then that's it. You got it?
Yes. Can you tell me, these choreographers, where are they coming from? Or how do you choose and make your selection?
I choose them because for different reasons. One, I try to make that it makes sense, the three of them together. I try to bring a lot of it. I want to use the word identity, because a lot of it is questioning and people who maybe have more complex identity or multiple identities, and the power and richness of that. And so bringing that, and also bringing the focus to Mali, because I think a lot of the time Mali looks out and up, and I wanted to really refocus on the what's happening and what's growing and what's so much coming out of energy-wise, of being and creating in Mali. And so actually a lot of the choreographers I've invited so far are either from West Africa for now, but from West Africa and live abroad or live in between. And so that's also an opportunity to, when you've left and you live abroad, and the opportunity to come back and connect or reconnect with the dancers there. Or are from, a lot of them are, actually all of them have that, or come from Bintou Dembélé, for example. She never lived in Senegal, but her parents immigrated to France, and so she has a link to West Africa in that sense of identity, and it questions her own identity, and that was for her a big thing to come and to get to work in West Africa, because she questions her Africanité in France, and now that was kind of giving her the opportunity to question it in Africa. So, yeah.
So, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Naomi, you heard about the festival. It's still a baby.
It's a baby. It's a very baby. That's why I'm so. I don't know what I'm doing here, but thanks for inviting me. And we're doing the 3rd edition this coming January. It's a yearly event, hopefully.
Yeah, good luck. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you very much for having us here. So I'm Nikisi Serumaga. I'm the programs manager of 32 Degrees East.
Hello, I'm Rashida Nalumoso. I'm creative producer working with 32 Degrees East.
Yeah, so 32 Degrees East is an organization that started in 2012, and it was called Ugandan Arts Trust. I guess I'll tell you guys the more interesting side of the history. We were started in 2012 by 2 British women, actually. And they started a residency program with space for Ugandan artists to be able to have access to a library, also to the curatorial support of the team, and a very, very, very tiny, embarrassingly tiny budget, which is difficult to expand on. But essentially, in Kampala, there's a really big gap between university and gaining really strong technical skills, but unfortunately not nearly as strong conceptual skills. So as an organization, we primarily focus on that. Also born out of this line of thinking was Kla Art, which is a public art festival that happens every 2 years in Kampala. And I guess it's kind of a way for the residency program to expand and be on the streets. So now we are in our 6th year, which is pretty interesting. And we still continue with the residency programs, and we took a break from Kla Art in 2016 and revived it again this year, which was really exciting. I don't know if you know.
Oh yeah, and I think as arts programmers who work with a visual arts organisation, particularly in a country where there's limited opportunities for artists to particularly have platforms for support and development, we wanted to use Kla Art to take a position as arts programmers about saying where we kind of, how we stand and represent an art sector that is very much emerging, and also as arts organisers, particularly thinking about just the documentation of work and the platforms for artists. How can we use our festival to be able to do that? It's very much an art festival in and with the city. We're specifically placing artists among audiences in very public locations, and that's really important when there are very few gallery spaces anyway, and we're interested in finding new relationships between artists and audiences. So it really was a journey of curatorial thinking, particularly in the development of our festival theme, which was off the record. In Kampala, Uganda's got a very much a contested history where we're thinking about who is it who writes our history, where are the archives for how we talk about ourselves, who's had the power to document that. And we kind of threw it out to artists to respond to our festival theme. And that came back to us in very many interesting different ways, from thinking about what is official record and archive, quite literally. One artist applied with a project which was looking at the missing archives and history between the British the point when Uganda was a protectorate, and the history between the UK and Uganda, and what are the records that are literally quite missing. And then from one artist who also had quite a different project in terms of a personal interpretation of what is it to go off the record. As a female in Kampala, a very, very male-dominated city, she created a rage room, which we put on top of a very central downtown location, which was a safe space for the women of Kampala to come and rage. And so we really interpreted our festival theme in multifarious ways, from dance to photography to installation, and it was very much in and with the city throughout the month of August. And as a month, I think that also allowed us to really develop our audiences and to have conversations of dialogue, and we included a number of workshops and spaces for discussion alongside the presentation and development of work as well. So alongside the commission, artists had 3 months to actually develop their ideas, and we offered as a curatorial team the support and development for that, which is also really important, where it's not just a product-based approach, and we're not, it's a full commission. Artists get the support and development to present work without the pressure to sell. And it's about developing the audiences in Uganda. We had artists from across East Africa and internationally, which was really fantastic. But our point is to also develop the Ugandan arts sector and to work with Ugandan artists and for them to have dialogue with others across the continent.
Yeah, and I guess just to add on to that, if you're looking at Cla Art as well, it's kind of an extension, a really big extension on our residency program, and then also a way to be able to cultivate audiences. We're also trying to do that through other ways. As you can imagine, the arts industry and patronage is really limited in Kampala. So we're doing experiments like trying a dinner called Palette once every 2 months. It's the only paid programming that we have, or programming where we ask people to pay. And it's a fundraiser where we bring 50 people to a dinner and have a silent auction and bring our previous artists in residence their work there. So there's a number of different ways that we're really trying to see, okay, on what levels are we speaking to the many different audiences that we have? The person who's standing on Chiembe Lane where the rage room is certainly not the person who's coming to Palette, but we have a multiplicity of different kinds of artists, and they need to speak to many different kinds of audiences in a variety of different ways. So we're definitely not doing all of them, but we're trying to see where we can create space, different ways of entering conversation with people who are interested in the art that we want to create, especially in a city where there really is a lot of art and creation and reinvention of materials all the time. So how are we looking at that in arts and non-arts ways as well? Yeah. And then I guess, why are we doing what we're doing? It's always a good question. I guess for me, very personally, I'm half Ugandan, half Mozambican, lived in Toronto, da-di-da-di-da. And there's a lot of, when I was coming back to Kampala, I was quite specific about the fact that I wanted to be able to experiment. So 32 is a really ripe space for that. We're a team of 4, so we're quite small and quite nimble. We get to do a lot of different things that I wouldn't have been able to do at previous larger organizations I was working in. And one of the things that I definitely saw in Kampala, which was quite strong in the generation and a half older than me, is there was really a lot of solitary, isolated work. It's very competitive, and although there was a lot of really great work produced, there was also something about this energy which was quite destructive. It's naturally changing, and there is a lot more collaboration and working across people. In all of that, and thinking about it from the institutional point of view, there's a lot of institutions that then were always new. Everything was always new. Here's this new thing, this new idea, this new person, and it stands on its own, and then ultimately, sometimes it also dies on its own. I was interested in the fact that 32 was 6 years old, and particularly with the fact that Cla Art had gone on a break, I wanted to see if we could revive it to try and keep on a sense of continuity between the things that we're doing, so that we can also have institutions which are much less personality-driven and much more legacy-driven by the legacy of the organization itself, and we can kind of stop this thing of like, the man with the key is gone, so-and-so left this organization, now everything falls apart. I want to see how it can go past that, if it's possible.
And I myself am a British Londoner. I grew up between the UK and Uganda, and I'm very also interested in how do we create the institutions that are the platforms for artists and audiences where, you know, Uganda culture is happening on the street, that's there, it's a material culture, but we've got very few spaces for the support and development of recognizing how artists play into that, and I'm interested in how we can create the new ways for dialogue, and festival particularly as a platform. Festivals are a great space for sharing ideas, and my career as a programmer has always been around finding that meeting point for artists and audiences, and 32 is a rare space to be able to do that in Kampala.
Thanks a lot.
My name is Ayikwe Manche Ayikwe. I'm from Accra, Ghana. Are you going to ask me questions?
No, you can just present your festival.
Oh, this is a really old photo, like super old. Where did you find that? Oh my yeah, this is like from 2008. Anyway, so I direct a festival called Chaliwate. It's an independent, multidisciplinary festival. So let's backtrack to 2008, which is actually when Accra Adult Alt was formed. Together with a film company, I just left the corporate space, and I'll tell you a little story, and then we can dive straight into it. Like, Ghana is a place of consistent erasure, you know, and it comes in different forms. The most obvious one is the colonial part, but then also there's this, we inherited this superstructure that only knows how to erase, you know. So post-independence Ghana, everything that was connected to Kwame Nkrumah was systematically dismantled, you know. By the last major cultural project that we had was the 1971 Soul to Soul concert that had the best of the US meeting the best of Accra. There's a documentary on it, Soul to Soul, you should watch it. After that, the Arts Council of Ghana collapsed. It was military intervention after military intervention after military intervention until 1992 when we switched to what's supposed to be a democracy. It's an interesting experiment. But by the time post-revolution period, there was no cultural infrastructure, like nothing at all. And there was also no space for artists to practice, to conceptualize, to build, to network. And, you know, you can choose to live in that and complain or fix it. So in 2006, just me and a few friends of mine started having these gatherings we call Talk Party. And, you know, we gather and we talk about everything that is wrong. But, you know, that gets boring after a while. You know, you get together and whine about whatever. So in 2009, we tried out our first experimental project. It was a music project, particularly focused on alternative music and experimental music. Because in Ghana, if you're not paying DJs to play your music, you play it in your house with your friends, like nobody will ever hear it. After 2009, we realized there was a bigger potential, and there was also an audience for music and art that was not mainstream. 2010, we had a bigger experimental music concert that has now turned into a festival. In 2011, April of 2011, we proposed Chaliwate at a talk party. And July 16, 2011, we had our first shot at it with no money. There were about 60 people at the talk party when we conceptualized it. When we got together to actually do it, there was just 8 of us. Yes, everybody ran away. So fast forward to 2018, Chaliwate is 8 years old, and we're doing over 50,000 people coming to Accra. to participate. This year we had our biggest international artist participation, over 30 international artists coming to participate, and also collaborate with Ghanaian artists. Also what we do at Accra Alt is that we put artists together, particularly Ghanaian artists and artists from elsewhere, to create projects. So all year round, some of them are virtual, some of them happen in our space. So we're based in Jamestown. Jamestown is it's a very historical space within Accra. A lot of Ghana's political history has been shaped by this space. It also has a high concentration of human harvesters. So across West Africa, there are about 63 forts that were used to transport the enslaved across the Atlantic. Ghana has 52 of them. And there are 2 big ones in Jamestown and 4 smaller ones. So beneath all of that, too, there's like a small town beneath us in Jamestown, tunnels, mesas, spaces that people were taken through. So, we're sitting on top of all this history and heritage and pain and anguish. That is also sort of a motivation, we don't particularly dwell on it. It's something to remember, but actually we're creating new memories and creating new experiments, and also building knowledge. Between 2008 and now, we've managed to archive a significant portion of what we produce, and you won't find it in a public library, and you wouldn't find it in a university, but we're now making it accessible to research students who are writing about art or writing about contemporary cultural developments on the continent. So over the last 8 years, what we've managed to do basically is create a virtual archive of new knowledge. And also, our thing is that I think that academics like to make up a lot of words, and making up words have become like a preserve of academics. In our space, we tell everybody, whatever you're doing, if you can't find an English word for it, you make up a word, and we use that to define it, and that becomes something that defines somebody's practice. That isn't, you wouldn't find in a dictionary, or you wouldn't find in some scholarly whatever. Anyway, I mean, that's what we do at Accra. We also, so we have a music festival that is much older than Chalewote, but some Chalewote sort of drowned everything. Sabulai Radio, which was our first cultural experiment for artists that were creating music on the fringe, That happens every December. It's also become a space for conversation of creating new music and what it means to produce music independently in a space where there's no infrastructure and no governmental support for any kind of cultural project, So I'd say that over the last 8 years, we've managed to create a space for independent cultural production, and it's mushrooming all over the place. There are people who are coming along. Young people are investing in galleries. All the new galleries that are coming up in Accra now are run by young people who are less than 30, And 10 years ago, there wasn't that. 10 years ago, nobody was even talking about art in Accra, And now we've managed to sort of create a space for art research, collection. We're drawing quite a significant number of collectors into Chalewote. Also this year, we started an art fair. We've been making art for art's sake for the last 8 years, and if we have to think about independent status and how we're raising money ourselves, we thought that it was good to also start to sell the art, So this year we had our first art fair, and before I left Accra, we sold 2 works, and this morning I got some news that one particular work that I want to move, somebody has asked for it, so.
Congratulations. Thanks a lot for presenting.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Cécile.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Taïm.
So we're running art space in Antananarivo, the capital city of Madagascar, for 7 years now. And so it started as an art gallery, so an exhibition space, as Tahin is a painter, artist, and he was really frustrated by the lack of space to exhibit the work, as there were nothing in the country. And 4 years ago, we had the opportunity to move in a much bigger space, which is called La Teinturerie, an old laundry, where we could do much more than just a gallery. So it's now also a studio space. There is a stage, a small restaurant. Soon there will be a digital art center, a record studio, so it gets bigger and bigger. And so the launch of the space was also the first edition of the Festival d'Art Urbain, so a street art festival. We organized thanks to Helvetia's support, but also a few South African artists that were really supportive with all the space and what we try to do in Madagascar. And so the festival is mainly like 2 weeks with 15 to 20 artists coming from Madagascar, but also South Africa, African country from the region, and also connecting to islands, so Mauritius, Comoros, other island of the region, and to bring them together from different disciplines, but more visual artists, and they bring them together to share experiments, try to collaborate on collaborative pieces for the public space. So one objective is also to bring this art outside of the La Teinturerie to allow many people to have access to art. You might not know Madagascar, but there is no art school, no art institutions. There is a Minister of Culture, but we never see any of them. So in this really rough context, we try to bring art to many places, people, to valorize artists. So yeah, this is mainly.
Désolé, je peux parler en français, no problème. Le festival Art Urbain, on a créé en 2014. Et pourquoi on a fait ça? Parce que à Madagascar, il n'y a pas de structure ni infrastructure culturelle. Et nous sommes les seules galeries d'art contemporain à Madagascar. Et il y a beaucoup d'artistes qui ont envie de s'exprimer, qui ont envie d'exposer, qui ont envie de rencontrer des gens, mais il n'y a pas d'espace. Donc on a parti dans les idées que l'espace public, c'est vraiment un lieu magnifique pour s'exprimer. Et on a commencé de grouper quelques artistes et on essaie de créer des petites mini-festivals au début, de montrer ce qu'on a envie de faire et montrer que même s'il n'y a pas de toutes ces structures, toutes ces infrastructures à Madagascar, on peut faire l'art qu'on aime, on peut faire développer ce qu'on a à notre objectif, parce que la promotion et la valorisation de l'art contemporain à Madagascar, beaucoup de problèmes à régler, parce que gérer les frustrations des artistes, gérer l'organisation, gérer tout, parce que nous, on gère tous les artistes, parce qu'il n'a pas beaucoup de choses. Donc ça, c'est le travail plus dur qu'on essaie de trouver solution. Je sais pas. C'est mieux que Cécile exprime bien en anglais, en français, je suis un peu timide.
I hope the one who can understand French won't listen to the translation because it's always really different. But what he was telling is about the hard work of bringing all those artists together and to manage their frustration and the timeline, and because it's 2 really intense weeks, but it brings many things to the public space and to the people, and so this is mainly why we do it.
Thanks a lot.
Managing director of Hamana Artist House. It's a place where we cherish the art of encounter. The very first encounter that brought this project to existence was an unusual one, especially in the Lebanese context. I don't know if some of you are familiar with it. So basically, around 4 years ago, a businessman who's directing a bank in an Arab country and whose mother is from the village of Hamana, which is like outside of Beirut, and that's another important issue to mention. It's a small village which is 40 minutes away from Beirut. His mother is from there, and before the Lebanese civil war, he used to spend all his summers there, and he left with the outbreak of the civil war. And traveled the world, and then came back and felt the change of how cultural life has completely diminished in the villages. And he decided to buy the house that was right in front of his house and thought to turn it into a cultural space. And the interesting point in this is that with his quest of trying to make this project happen, he met several artists and several cultural operators. And then he settled on an arts collective, which is Collectif Kahraba, who are an independent artist collective who have always worked in decentralization, packing their performances in their car, doing like over 200 performances across the country. And they had, some years back, in 2012, also established a festival, which is more like a collaborative platform. And it's a festival in the public space, so they occupied, it's the place where they were living, and it's a neighborhood, a very popular neighborhood in Beirut. And they started a festival there where they would invite local and international artists to work with the residents and the neighbors of the neighborhood. And the festival was called Us, the Moon, and the Neighbors. So this encounter that happened about 4 years ago allowed the conceptualization and the development of what opened last summer and what is Hamana Artist House. The advantage of this is that very often when artistic projects go into a space, they have to fit into the space. And the advantage of this project is that it was mainly the whole architectural plans were done after the concept and after the vision of what the space is going to be. So it's a house of 1,000 square meters. Actually, if you go on house spaces, we can see a bit more. It's not possible. Okay. Okay, it's fine. Well, you can check it online later. So basically, it's 1,000 square meters of spaces, of professional spaces for artists and professional spaces to host audiences. We opened our doors in August 2017, and since then we've hosted 350 artists and more than 10,000 spectators. The house is focused mainly on performing arts, but it's also a multidisciplinary space. What we call like the 5 pillars of the house are creation, so it's dedicated to art residencies, and people and artists are invited to spend time and work in the space and then encounter the audience. Presentation, so we have a year-round artistic program, which is also not a given because it's outside of Beirut and because it's on an altitude where in the winter in Hamana it snows. And the third dimension is access, so we have several outreach projects that happen in the neighboring region, but also with partners across the country. the fourth one is learning. So the space also allows for workshops and educational trainings and opportunities for artists and non-artists to learn and develop artistic skills. And the last dimension, which is the fifth pillar, is the expansion, which is something that we call the professional dimension. So all of us in the team, we've been working a lot internationally and have somehow gathered a number of, well, to make it simple, we have met so many great people around the world. And we think that these conversations are always very important to make us question everything we do on a daily basis, and we need that. So it's a dimension that we cultivate highly in the space, so we keep on inviting new people to tell us that what we are doing is probably maybe not the best option, and that there's other opportunities and other possibilities, or maybe we can just sit down and think together. So these are the 5 main things that we do. You can check out more on all our social media pages, and
You are
that's it.
perfect. It's 7 minutes. Thanks a lot.
Is it on time?
It's perfect.
Okay. We can talk more anyway.
Hello, my name is Benedikt Reising. Yeah, that's why I actually play the saxophone, because I don't have to talk while doing this. Yeah, but thank you. Yeah, I'm from Berne, Switzerland, and I'm a musician, and I also run a festival called Jazz Werkstatt. Werkstatt is a German word for carpentry, workshop, yeah, a place where you work. And jazz is jazz, but the festival is, as we understand jazz, it's a very open thing. Was ist Vorwurf?
Kann ich dir gerade nicht sagen.
Sometimes people say, okay, they just treat jazz as a 4-letter word, and yeah, this is somehow right, because we have also sometimes hip hop or electronic or experimental music, and the idea of the festival is to bring people from all around the world together to create new music or to present new music. And yeah, we started 13 years ago when we were young and nobody would listen to our music, and we thought, okay, we will create our own space and to present our music, and then it grew, and we traveled more, and now it's more. Now the festival is more about collaboration with musicians we meet on our tours, and even the programmation is a collaboration. We change every year or every 2 years the program team, and this year and next year it's Shane Cooper from Cape Town, Johannesburg, and yes, this is it.
But you are yourself also traveling all the time, meeting new people, or you are more now on the saxophone again, and it's just running by other people? I didn't got that. Are you still working for the organization, or just it's now running and other people are in charge?
Yeah, I mean it's a very little festival. It's every year 5 days, and I'm honored to be in the row with all these big festivals. So my main thing is being a musician and traveling and playing, and the festival is Yeah, my baby somehow.
Which is now a teenager.
Yes.
Congratulations. That's it. Thanks a lot.
Good morning, my name is Sophie Becker. I'm artistic co-director of Spielart Festival. Spielart is based in Munich, Germany. Munich is the second biggest city in Germany, very rich and very conservative. Spielart is a biennial event. It takes place every second year in autumn, October, beginning of November. We present theater, performance, dance, sometimes an exhibition, sometimes film, and always a very big discourse format with panels, discussions, and artist talk. The festival is quite old. It was established 25 years ago by my colleague Tilman Broschard. He's now about to retire, and I will take over, and so we are in a state of transition since 2 years for another 3 years, so it's a very, very long transition phase, but it's, for us, it makes sense to rethink this festival because it's quite old, and the situation in the theater in Germany and in Germany in general changed a lot within the last years. When I started to work as artistic co-director, we were thinking about what is special about this festival, and perhaps the most important thing is that it's biennial, so we have a lot of time, which is really precious for us. And we decided that we would try, it was always labeled an international festival, but in the past it was usually 95% European performances and then 3 performances from Argentina or China, and it was then a so-called Chinese focus. And we decided to really work internationally. That means we started to travel. And we are still trying to enlarge our program group. We work with co-curators. I will speak in the afternoon about it, so that we try to work with as many co-curators, colleagues and artists who help us to do our research. And in the frame of the last edition, this is our program page. We presented a lot of South African artists. We worked together with Jay Parser from UCT in Cape Town, and we worked together with Scene Asia. It's a curatorial collective from which is organized by different curators from Asia. And at the moment, I'm again traveling. I have been to Charlotte Festival 2 weeks ago, to Live Art, and we are developing our program, and as I said, the next edition will take place in October, November. For us, important at the moment is that the situation in Germany changed a lot, so to the worse. When I grew up, Germany was almost boringly safe, and it was very, very stable. And in the last years, there was a financial crisis in Europe, so which of course affected mainly the countries from the south. But the idea of Europe changed a lot, and there was a Brexit, and now we are facing huge problems with the extremist right parties all over Europe. And perhaps you read about it. There was a very heavy incident in Chemnitz, a city in the eastern part of Germany 2 weeks ago. They were chasing migrants for 2 days, and the police was either unable or unwillingly willing to stop the situation. And this changed our work as well. So there's very little knowledge in Germany about the colonial past. I think one reason is that we lost the colonies quite early after World War II. So I'm teaching at a theater academy, and even my students who are now at the beginning of their 20s, they do not learn at school that Germany had colonies. And there's really, it's always for our artists, it's very difficult that they face an audience which is very interested, but have not that much knowledge about this part of history. And then with the situation in Germany getting worse with the right wing, even colleagues of mine who are, from the left, they say at the moment it's more important to focus on our own problems and do not that much international work. But actually we do not believe in that, because the world is so interconnected nowadays, and it would be stupid now to return to focus on just German problems and German artworks, and therefore for us it's important to continue with the international work, to provide a space for meeting, for partying as well, but we need to defend it at the moment.
Okay, thanks a lot.
So I will speak about the festival, but first about the place I run. It's called Curtiosan. It's based in Senegal. I created this space with my husband in 2002 in Dakar, in a private house. It's a space for artistic and social experiment, focus on new media. Kern means house, and Tiosan is a traditional Senegalese culture. So we try to connect tradition and new technology. The first aim was to give access to, in 2002, to give access to Senegalese and artists to new media, to create and to have African contents on the internet. It's also a space linked with the surrounding neighborhood, with even if we do, so we do many workshops, artist residence, and trainings, and we focus mainly on open source software. We have the will to sharing knowledge and really help artists and developers to be on the move. We try to see what artistic and digital practice, what they imply in the other fields like education, citizenship, and so we have a festival that we have started in 2008 called Afropixel, so where we have a reflection about new media and the society. So the 6th edition was, for 4 years now we work a lot about commons, the subject of commons, formal and informal commons in the city like Dakar. So to put that concrete, we opened a School of Commons through an artistic garden and a fab lab in the public space. And we try to document, invite artists to work. And so before the 4th edition was about Garden of Resistance. The last one was about, the 5th edition was about the city and the commons. We do the festival during the Biennale, Dakar Art Biennale, so we are in the off of the Biennale, but we have connection with the Biennale. And the last edition was about non-aligned utopias. We came back to the new technology and digital imaginaries. We are part of a bigger project between ZKM in Germany and with Art Museum and Fakukesi Festival in Joburg that's happened now. And we try through artist residence, workshops, 2 months before the Biennale, and public talk also to have a reflection about new media and their impact in the society.
Thanks a lot. Wonderful. So this was the speed dating, 8 presenters in 1 hour. I think we are on time for that. But
so in South Africa, often when stuff happens, we ask 3 questions: for who, for what, for why. So we start with these kinds of quite simple questions about how you understand your practice as a writer in the world, in relation to the world. So beginning with a bit of a question about why you write and what originally really impelled you into this very particular practice. And maybe we begin with Enos on my right, if that's okay.
Hello, everyone. Enos Nyamor from Nairobi, Kenya. Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting us here, and also trying to, make our work valid, because in the media houses, you're not really taken seriously. You're like the black sheep or something. So why I write is because I don't prefer absolutism. Like, I don't like things to be fixed. And that's the work of culture journalists, to extend cultural conversations, discussions, to bring in new discussions, and also maybe to forecast, because we really work with artists, we work with creatives. So we are really engaged in future projects, things that are not happening, ideas that are not really pervasive, but they represent some hope for the future. So my first reason for writing is just to overthrow absolutism, yeah, and also to document the events of our time. Yeah, also to document events of our time, because from the presentation in the morning, you saw Jian said something about our literature depending on something that was wrote by Europeans, and even at the moment, most of critical work on culture, on arts, is written by Europeans or people from Britain or whatever. So I think my second purpose is to document. Yeah.
Millie?
Yeah, so first and foremostly, I write so that I can materialize interiority, the interior space as a valid space, to make that valid and visible to myself when I read back my own words, as well as to the outside world, which seems to prioritize exteriority. I also write so I can feel less isolated about the things that are happening in this interior space, less crazy, less lonely, and I guess also documenting, as an exercise. I feel better when I've written something after I'm upset, like most writers. When you're upset or whether you're happy about something, to put it down on paper, there's a cathartic experience that happens there. And because I'm reading myself constantly from the perspective of the political, as in I read myself as black, as African, as woman, as middle class, as English speaking, as heterosexual, as queer, but also those physical markers of identity, the visible markers of identity, constantly in tension with the fact that ndingumtu also, which is that I am umtu, loose translation, a person. But how do these two tensions of being a human and the condition of being human, which for me is the interior stuff, and then the condition of being a black person or a woman, whatever, which is the exterior stuff. So how do those two things constantly collide, and how can I convey that through my writing, as a form of documentation, as a form of response, but also as a form of catharsis?
It's very hard to add to that. Yeah, I feel like pressured.
You can just say.
I agree.
Ditto.
Ditto, exactly. Definitely ditto. But for me, it's also a way of seeing the world, I guess. And I think when I write, I like to think that other people are thinking along with me, and that's a mode of communication, just as speaking is somehow. And that really sort of excites me. This makes me want to communicate, to share, to think along with people. But also there is this imperative that you're constantly, of course, this is super idealistic, but you're constantly trying to write what is not yet written, so sort of to invoke it, to bring it. And yeah, probably this is why I do it, because there's lots that has not been said in our context, different contexts, whether, you know, South Africa, Egypt, Kenya, so yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Okay, so I've been working as an arts journalist in South Africa for the last 10 years, and it always felt like a responsibility, even at times when I quit my job or went to study or decided to do something, to try something else. It felt like, especially because the community of arts writers or journalists was getting smaller and smaller, it felt like there were missing gaps between those people who are actually the bridge between the artists and the public. So that's where I find myself, being the communicator between trying to understand an artist's work or communicate an artist's work to the public in general. And that's pretty much it. It feels like it's important to do, and it falls under documenting and capturing a certain moment in time. But yeah, it's something that I always feel a very strong responsibility to try and also that comes with that responsibility is knowing what you're writing about or having some kind of context, which often is missing. How do you write about ballet if you have no kind of reference? Or how do you write about jazz if you don't know certain? You can do it, but there's a responsibility there even to dig into these histories before, you know, if you're really gonna try and critique someone, you have to know your stuff. So it's about constantly learning and finding a voice, developing a voice. But yeah, the field of arts journalism in South Africa is in danger from my perspective. And yeah, that's it.
I think why I write is constantly evolving. Initially, when I started writing, I used to write at least for pleasure, to I guess sort of put my own thoughts and voices on the page. Now, maybe I write to resolve questions that I have, or to try to answer them. So for instance, what does it mean when Macron makes a grand statement about institution, when there have been people talking about that, in Nigeria at least, for decades, and it becomes this thing. I write to learn, increasingly, because so much I don't know. I write to fill gaps. I think my own context as a Nigerian, just talking about that on my table, is sort of history is this seen as, I think, almost seen as an indulgence, is seen as secondary. So yeah, right to just fill the things that are missing. It's an impossible job because it can never be finished. But yeah, so reasons why I write.
Great, thanks. So one last round prompted by me, and it's a question which is about traditionally the practice of art and of writing about art has often been seen as something that is the preserve of a small few, that is a kind of elite and often slightly disconnected world. I'd be interested in people's thoughts about their vision for writing in that sense of who is the writing for? How does one reach a kind of relevant wider audience that is not this sort of abstracted, homogenous middle class, historically in the field of sort of international cultural journalism, quite monochromatic audience. And so. Anyone can jump in there.
I think something what I've been taught and I think I've learned now is, for me in my writing, clarity is always important. Clarity is probably the most important thing. I don't think if writing doesn't speak if your writing is deliberately set up to speak to a specific set of people, or it's niche, as people say, quite frankly, I think it could be if it's a scientific journal, but I think that kind of writing is useless. In terms of like art writing, I think then, or rather how I like to write is relating the art on the wall with what is going outside the gallery. Talking or criticizing or reviewing art specifically has, as Emily said yesterday, what does it do for people? How does it help people? What does it mean? Does it mean anything? I think that's increasingly important. If art is being made about people, even in analyzing, in distilling it back to them, they need to be able to get it. I think that's very, very, very important. Yeah.
Would anyone else like to comment on this?
Thank you again. And I don't think I write for the preserved few or the elite. I try as much as possible to be a writer, and that means to communicate with anyone who can read and write. So I try as much as possible. And also, I am aware that not everyone can be in the same space at the same time, and some artistic expression are ephemeral, they're temporary. So just to extend that reach and to provoke, to extend the discussions that were in the gallery to a wider audience. But of course, you know that our only problem or challenge is that art stories sometimes are not clickbait. Yeah, they're not like they're not like the mostly read. But that also depends. It's an issue of art education, which is not only our duty, but even the artists. And also, I like to talk to the artists in the room. Please, even though eccentricity is good, please try to reach out to others. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a very difficult question to answer. It's almost impossible if you look at art only within the context of contemporary art. So I have not been able to answer this question as somebody who curates arts and culture section in a newspaper. I'm lucky to have the word culture next to art, because it means that I have a little bit more room to play in terms of how to respond by constantly juxtaposing art and culture, ensuring that they belong together, not separating the art and only responding from that perspective, because the art that comes through to me on a weekly basis is usually from the gallery space, formalized institutions which are quite closed. There's a ring fence around them, and then you end up speaking to the same crowd, which on 2 pages out of 8, I can do that. I'm happy to do that. It keeps my relationship with the galleries, the artists, good. Sometimes advertising-wise, when the people in finance and the newspaper are like, we need advertisers, it's good to be invited to a Pro Helvetia thing, because I give space to Pro Helvetia somewhere. But I resolve that by ensuring that there's a culture story next to the art story, so that the person who's not interested in engaging with the Yinka Shonebari exhibition at Goodman, because they've never heard of it, can read a story about Busiswa, a pop star, on the next page. I think that is how we can try to respond to this question of why are we only speaking to ourselves constantly? Everywhere you go, it's like that hipster thing of every time I travel to places, I criticize the fact that there's like a place with like particular Scandinavian design, a coffee shop with, you'll have like almond milk and like chai latte or whatever. I criticize it, but I still want it. I'll still go to that shop because it's familiar to me. So how do we speak to ourselves about the things that we're interested in, which I don't think we should be ashamed of being interested in the things that we're interested in as artists, and really indulging ourselves sometimes without this desire to please everybody, because we can't. But ensure that we're constantly taking art outside of the context of the gallery and this navel-gazing thing that we like to do, and engaging with the culture. So there have been times when I haven't wanted a nicely written academy's response of an exhibition, and I've gone and said, my friend who lectures at WITS, to say, okay, I would like for this review to be done by 3 of your students, or can you make this an exercise that your class, your 3rd year visual art class, does as a way to respond to the exhibition, but in a newspaper, in a public space. So then that becomes easier for him as the lecturer. That creates an opportunity for the students to write for a newspaper from their different perspectives, and it gives more room. So there's been times when I've had to challenge myself of, okay, can I get a different voice to respond to this thing? But of course, it's not always easy on a weekly basis from my individual experience. But I think the idea is to constantly ensure that art engages with culture and culture engages with art, and the culture is then the people, it's the us, it's the clothing, it's the language, it's the hair, it's everything else that is not inside the gallery. So how do those things constantly collide with each other?
Just to add my little 5 cents to this, because I'm coming from, I hear you and what you're saying, because that's like the contemporary art world. So this idea of art speak, which happens all too often, the language and the words that we use to describe artwork, art history, art, it's super inaccessible to me. And I'm a writer with degrees, you know, like pretty average normal person, but like I can't even understand half of the stuff that's being said. So then I think about what are we dealing with South Africa? A lot of illiteracy, a lot of uneducated people. So when you think about who's the audience and how to reach the biggest audience, you have to look at what is the most popular newspaper that people are reading. It's a tabloid called the Daily Sun or the Daily Voice in Cape Town. It's written in the easiest, even like sometimes slang, you know, it's not something we want to necessarily put out. But I think in my writing, I always try to work for mainstream platforms, but bring in underground cultures and underground scenes. So, and a lot more recently, it's been work by Black artists or Black musicians or Black writers, because this is underrepresented all the time. So we have to like bring focus to things that are ignored by the mainstream narrative, but bring it into mainstream publications. Another thing is, the thing about access is that I've avoided writing for online publications for a very long time, for the sake that accessibility, again, not everyone is connected to not everyone is receiving their news online. Not everyone has access to online platforms. It's a big assumption to think that that's how the whole country functions, if I'm just talking about South Africa. So only of recent times have I started moving more towards a digital platform because it reaches a global audience. But yeah, I think access is very important, and writing in language that's easy to understand. Yeah.
I think also, aside from who's the audience and why do we write, because we encountered this question many times before, especially in Europe, there is a sense that journalism is dying, or print journalism is dying, and art criticism is dying, and you know that art writing is the relic, and so on and so forth. And I don't think this question translates very well, at least in my context. I think there's an enormous interest in art and culture where I come from. I think people are very, not just curious, but very eager to actually have a conversation. And then it's really important that someone then, from this context, is able to speak to people and tell them, yes, it's good you're curious. Why are you curious? Do you know what practices are being done? Like you said, the responsibility of making what's not known, and sort of bring that into a larger debate. Maybe, again, this doesn't translate very well to our respective contexts, but I don't think it's sort of a dying form or at all irrelevant at this point. That's my own experience.
Okay, and then in conclusion, because we are slightly out of time now, if there are any thoughts or things that came up from your conversations at the individual tables that were for you interesting, unexpected, that you'd like to very, very briefly share as a last point.
I've just gone blank. Could you repeat what you just said? It's a good thing I record everything. I like write. I like taking notes. So one of the questions, of course, my piece, which is part of this reading, was about political art and how artists are really discussing political, issues. And one of the colleagues asked me if I have this fear of implicating the artists, knowing the very well sometimes political and economic situations in a least developed world or third world. So, yeah, that's one thing. I'm always vigilant. I do not want to implicate the artists so much and to make them lose future opportunities, because I might have my very radical views, also Marxist or capitalist view. But I also always try not to implicate that so much, just to confine myself to something that relates to the topic, without also painting them maybe as chauvinist or biased or bigots. I always try to extend discussion and to move away from the person to just the issue that they're raising. For that matter, you'll find that I always try to avoid being biographical in my work, because also again, if you do not have anything to say about any work of art, for example, a painting, you'll start talking about the color tones, you start talking about whatever the structures, the patterns, without really extending the conversations. Yeah, thank you.
Any other last thoughts from your conversations on the floor?
In response to you, yes, I'm naming you. Because she asked me about, in my piece, I was separating style and form from content. And sort of, if that's a Western way of thinking, is that a Western sort of, mode of criticism? And I was about to answer her when you said we have to come up here. But it's a very important question, because I get asked this a lot, that somehow criticism, whether literary or visual, is somehow the privilege of the West, or it's a Western invention or the Western tradition. I think I disagree with that, but for many reasons, because I believe, for example, like I said, Arabic literature has a long tradition of criticism, very elaborate, almost mathematical in how elaborate it is. And I think the same goes for Indian literature and so on. But I think we do ourselves a disservice when we don't understand that it's all conflated, whether our own traditions or modern ones or Western ones. So when I write, when I criticize, when I think critically of something, of course, I invoke all of that. I invoke the very complex Arabic literary traditions, almost mathematical in how precise they are, but I also bring a lot of those Western ideas with me. I don't think the two should be separated. I don't think we have to constantly do this exercise of torture, that this is West, so we have to throw it, outside. No, because I'm sorry, I'm not sort of saying that this is where you were going with your question, but I felt personally attacked because I get asked this a lot, and as this is a Western invention, I'm like, well, you're all Westernized, whether you like it or not, So, but again, while maintaining this very critical look at oneself and what one is doing. Definitely, of course, but yeah.
Okay, last word from Millie.
We didn't get to a point of discussing form and structure at our table. We just ended up talking about this idea of loneliness, which if I try to engage it now, it's going to be lost and it's not going to be fair to the people listening. But I just want to talk about this idea of style and form, kind of put something out there. I'm quite insecure about my writing because we all are. Sure, we're all insecure about our writing, but my biggest insecurity is the lack of style and format that I didn't study at school, and I can't seem to find, or maybe I'm too insecure to go looking for ways to become a better writer. And how I've used the excuse that I've used, which is both relevant and naughty of me, is this idea of what is the point of writing? What is the point of communicating? it's really nice when a piece is like a piece of information and an idea is conveyed beautifully, but in a context where African literature is kind of at the bottom rung in terms of how advanced and how expansive and how established and institutionalized it is when you compare it to other forms of literature from other parts of the world, the idea of this audience and what are you trying to do with this information then comes into question. I once read an article in which I was talking about this idea of speaking proper English and what barriers that creates between people. So the article was called "You Drank My Juice," because I was having a conversation with somebody who kept saying, I drank his juice instead of drank his juice. And I kept wondering, do I say to this person, it's drank my juice, which obviously exposes my politics as like this middle-class person. And I couldn't help myself, and at the end I did say, you drank my juice. And he said to me, what is the point of communication? You understood what I'm trying to say. You understood the message of the idea of I drank your juice. Why do you have to correct me? In so doing, you are exposing your coloniality and your inextricable link to this Western formulations of communication. And you will sit at dinner tables and talk about Steve Biko and how woke you are, but actually you're not applying these principles in your everyday life. So then when it comes to the writing, what is more important in the context of Africa? Are we trying to perfect our ability to convey information, which I think coming into writing, going to school for writing, that was prioritized more than the idea you're trying to convey and how you're trying to convey this idea and to whom you're trying to convey this idea. So then it's a question of what's more important depending on where you are. If I'm at Yale, maybe it's much more important to have beautifully, what is that thing that man said about the sentences in good-looking sentences versus like information that's helpful to people or that is you can actually convey what you're trying to say in an easier way. And I wish to have more of this conversation without feeling ashamed of my fear of making good sentences. And a lot of my ideas get shut down behind this fear of I can't convey this thing in a way that so-and-so is going to approve of, but I'm sitting with this amazing idea that I'm insecure about conveying.
Great. I think that's a very helpful concluding set of thoughts. I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your texts, for sharing yourselves. And we move on to the next session with Misla.
Yeah, this is our third day about collaboration, and it's not about collabing, but I really, yesterday evening I had not crisis, but thinking, okay, it was interesting, but it's getting to be too much, and I can't take it more in. And then I was asking myself, but okay, what was in already? Have I listened some sentences, or at least one, that it really speak to me? And this gave me the idea to start this session with all of you in a moment of silence and think about the last 2 days and write down a sentence or several sentences that did really speak to you. And if it's not possible to quote them correctly, there's no drama. Just make sentences out of them because I want to collect them and I want to make a collective text out of them. So please write them down and I will come from table to table and explain how it will go on. It will be very easy. Just take you maybe 2 minutes to reflect, to write the sentence or two. If you have a lot of sentences because you were so good to take notes, then make a collection maybe of 3. It can be connected to terms of engagement, but it doesn't have to. And yes, please do that, and then it will continue. It would be cool if you now share these sentences to the one person that will write them down. So the basic idea on these sessions was to give room to different parts of this cultural production, and that we decided to do it with the artist on day 3 is not kind of taxonomy. It was more because we wanted to speak about Museum of Lungs. We thought we don't want to speak just in theory about collaboration. We thought it's nicer and better to speak about something that everybody has seen. And so I think almost everybody of you was yesterday or the day before in the show of Museum of Lungs. And now we will speak shortly about how did it start? Where did this collaboration start? So we will listen for this 4 artists, how it was for them. One is missing, Neo, the musician, is now almost already on stage. And the others who are missing, Laila will now announce.
So Neo Moyanga is missing, who you've seen on stage, but who also co-created the piece with us, and also Miriam Berger, who designed the lights, and Moira Guiron, who was in charge of scenography and costumes. And Stacey Hardy is here, who you've all seen on stage and heard the beautiful text of. Nancy Munir, also co-composer of music and live musician. And Marius Koop, who created the wonderful Stacy 2, and also trained Stacy on bringing Stacy 2 to life in a very brief period of time, and also contributed to the choreography of the moments in which Stacy 2 was alive. So, and I'm Laila Solomon, who directed and co-created the piece.
Yeah, and Leila, how did it start? How did it, what was the first encounter to say, okay, I want to do this piece with her?
I was invited by Shimuranga to participate to their program at the Raw Material Academy in Dakar. And there, Stacy very generously, during my contribution, which was a very practice-based one, shared parts of her writings about her personal life, because that day had questions about sharing personal content and in its relation to larger contexts or historical moments, and bringing these different formats together in a performative way. And when I listened to Stacy's text and how she read it, there's something that resonated with me in a very personal way, and started that inspiration of very impulsively telling Stacy that I know you're very busy, but if you had more time, I would have liked very much to make a performance out of this material. And Stacy then very impulsively also said, why not? Which she later expressed that she regretted.
Yeah, Stacy, what's your part of the story? Because
yeah, it was. I mean, it was a very funny story. I didn't know what I was saying yes to. This mad Egyptian arrived at the Dakar Academy. I was there with Chimuranga, who I work with, who are another group of people I collaborate with, and I participated in Leila's session. And afterwards, she said to me, do you want to do it? And it was the last thing I expected someone to ask me. I'm a writer, I'm not a performer. This was my first performance on stage, was in this show. So, so it was such a, when somebody asks you something that's so outside of your realm, and so what you're not expecting to come out of their mouth, there's kind of, I just said yes off the cuff, and I didn't know what I was saying yes to. And both of us, I think all of us, then had to kind of face the reality of there was a very intuitive connection of let's do this, and then it's the how and the what do you do. And I think that part of the saying yes was, I'm a great believer, we're talking here about collaboration. I'm a great believer that collaboration is friendship. And for me, it tends to work two ways. It's either I work with my friends, or I meet people whose work I'm very interested in, we instantly become friends. Jihan, someone like that. There's actually so many people in the room who I now consider my friends, but I met them what we would call the process of collaboration. And I think that those people who you keep working with, it's always starts with some kind of a spark of there's actually a friendship potential here. And with Leila, I think that was also very much that we quickly became, very quickly became very good friends. And that allowed us to tackle what ended up being an incredibly difficult process. You know, we said yes to doing this because we were both responding to things in the text we thought were important, but then I was facing the reality of, oh gosh, you're gonna have to perform this, and then Leila brought on, you're gonna have to work a puppet, which was another whole, you know, so there were all these things, and yeah, trauma. And then, of course, the material is very complex. And it's material that I feel very strongly about. I think the question of health and our health as a philosophical and a political question, and not just as a social question or a scientific or a medical question, is something that I think in this moment is very critical. I'm surrounded by people, and so many of my friends in that are feeling the world in their bodies. So the desire to make a work that somehow spoke to that, how does the world and the politics of the world interact and impact our bodies, was very important for me. But there's also something that was very complex in as a white South African, to start to talk about tuberculosis. You know, what are we doing? Are we doing a project of exception? Oh, all very comfortable and nice to speak from that position of that you're in a country where it is such a colossal problem, and where it's a treatable disease that still kills thousands of people, and the politics of that. And again, the question of, is it white? Again, yet another instance of a white person benefiting of black pain. So those kind of questions were extraordinarily difficult, and finding a language to perform this thing and to speak this thing, it's the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. I have never faced a project where I struggled so much with it, where I had so much heartbreak about it, where I cried so much about it. But I'm very glad that I pushed through, because there were times when I went, this is too difficult. I shouldn't be the person telling the story, let's stop. You know, and one of the beautiful parts about the collaboration, and one of the things when Leila said to me, when I got to a point and I said, like, I'm not the person to tell the story. It's actually ethically, I have a huge problem with myself telling the story. And Leila was like, but you're not telling the story alone. And of course, this was very true. Neo brought another whole layer, and Nancy brought another whole layer. And she's also somebody who's worked a lot with body and health, and as a musician. So I wasn't telling that story alone, and there's so much that ended up in the text. I'm down as the writer, but that's Neo as well. There are whole sections of this text that wouldn't be here without Neo, that wouldn't be here without Nancy. So in that way, I kept saying on the program, let's just put down all our names, because I feel like everyone did everything.
Thanks a lot. That says so much about collaboration. Yeah, Nancy, can you find some words for your wonderful music, and how did this collaboration start with Neo?
So I met Neo Muyanga in Cairo, and we started playing music together and having this encounter, and then Laila started speaking to me about this project, and it all looked very like not very real at the beginning. And then I came to South Africa last year to play a concert with Neo Muyanga, and then I found myself in archives and then into this crazy research that helped me a lot to discover things also about the music and the traditional music about health and the spirits and all this cultural side. And then I was in that situation, of course, of asking myself if I'm allowing myself to be part of that story or not, because I'm also Egyptian. So how I connect to it. but yeah, that was the main challenge for me.
Maybe you need to explain what you mean with that.
Like what? Tell the story of the. Like, for example, where, in one of the festivals many years ago, and I found an Australian guy speaking about the Egyptian revolution, and then I started like hitting him, like, why are you speaking about it? And I found myself also asking these questions of am I allowed to be part of that story or not? And for me, it's about collaborating with a bigger story, not just about South Africa, but about the disease and the spirits and all of that.
Yeah, am I allowed? I know this question myself from my collaboration here. And yeah, we have this somehow what you proposed, Pan-African collaboration, but now again one more, and why Switzerland? And why Basel? And how did you come into that? And did you feel allowed?
I didn't question this, if I feel allowed. I came very late, on a later point to the project. I just got a phone call one day from a producer in Basel, and she was asking me if I know a puppet maker. And I said, yeah, I know some puppet makers, but I'm also a puppet maker. And then she sent me the description of the project. I didn't know anyone of the project, so I got like a brief, what's it about? And then I read South Africa, the story about Stacy and being in Egypt and playing in Switzerland and in Germany, and I was like, okay, that's so many things. And the story about South Africa history and the personal story of Stacy, which lead me from a personal view. Okay, I can learn about something from this, like a very egoistic point of view. Okay, I want to learn about something about this history and getting a new culture, involved in a new culture. And the funny thing also was about this, just a project before, I also made a double of the actor from the piece. I was like, cool, it's another, also like an egoistic point of view. Then I just do something similar, but in a different context, like a double of the actor on the stage. And for me, this collaboration sometimes irritated me. For example, when we were in Egypt, I was never in Egypt, and we worked in Egypt, and everything was new for me, but we worked on South African history and the history of Stacy. And I was like, okay, what I'm talking, I was quite confused, but in this situation, to have all this new impulses feeding me for my personal, personal, how you say, development. So that's how I get engaged and diving in this engagement.
Yeah, thank you. Now I want to open it to all of you. So there either are also comments, questions are invited about your experience about this performance and together with this aspect of collaboration. And we will do it like a sharing, so that maybe several questions are in a row or descriptions, and then we give it back to you. And to give a start, I would like to give the word to Hannah from Kaserne Basel. They will show this piece as opening piece of their new season. And
Kaserne Basel is not only showing the piece. I mean, Sandro Lunen, the new director of Kaserne Basel, was the first supporter of the piece. So I don't think without their support and belief in the project very early on, the project could have at all gained life.
That's what I wanted to ask and have Hannah talk about, but thank you anyway. But still, I'm sure Hannah can tell a little bit more about it, and then followed by your comments and questions.
maybe the most important thing about this collaboration also from the side of Kaserne Basel, where I work together with Sandro Luni now, or we just started working. This collaboration with Laila and her collaborators started and was built on a long relationship and a friendship actually between Sandro and Laila that is has been going on and growing for the past, you'd name it, 15 years or so. So it's built on trust and a very honest friendship. And this way it was important maybe to start and support it from the beginning. And it was very clear to us that with these conditions, with this project idea, and with the artists who are in it, that it will be very interesting for us to support. And we're honored to welcome the project in Basel in 2.5 weeks, and very glad to open our first season with this.
I was just wondering about this. This is a huge collaboration in between, Egypt, South Africa, Switzerland, and in what terms it's also a bit of forced collaboration because there's the funding of all these partners. And I was just wondering, okay, maybe one part starts with a friendship or an idea, but there maybe afterwards, like there are other circumstances which follow up on this collaboration, and maybe just how the chronic or the development was, something like that.
I don't know if forced would be the right word for me. I think I would have to explain each part and divide the logic behind it. So just to say, so the first, of course, the core of the project are the 4 people who are Nancy, Neo, Stacy, and me, and the thinking of the project. But then came all the other elements that are needed. There are 2 things about that. One, I'm at a stage of my life where partially team is changing. So I've been working with people for quite a number of years, and for different reasons, personal and practical, that needed to change. So I needed to change a team, so it was a very open lookout for who will design lights, who will do production, and all of that. And as I said, since Sandro, now in his new position, was one of the first main supporters in that difficult period of team has to change, how do I do it? So a lot came also with his support through that. So that was the first connection to Basel. Second thing that has to be mentioned is visas are very difficult. And for now many years, not only the light designer, but also often the technician we've been working with, it's been to make life easier. Since we tour so much for Europe, and we can talk all about the complex system of that and the need to do that to survive and to make the work what we want to make, is how can we achieve that we have less visa processes, or how can it be a bit more practical? Because otherwise, especially with often technicians are men, then it's even more complex for someone from the Arab world to gain a visa. And then often you also, as little as possible, want to arrive in that situation where you arrive and people are not there with you. And it's happened. I've had blind musician not arrive because he was so dangerous, or it's happened that people just don't, especially men, don't get visas. And so it's been a very practical, pragmatic, to say it straight in the face, first thought. So if it has to be someone with a European passport, and we're anyway working so much with Kaserne Basel, so this was the first thought. The second thing was scenography. Moira Guérin, I already met in Berlin, in Gorky Theater. So it's someone whose work I was familiar with, and I found it also interesting to work with. And come to the puppet, I don't know if anybody's here has worked with puppets, but puppets are very substantial budgets, to say it very bluntly. And it was the two things of finding someone whose work in terms of style fit for the project, whose aesthetics were the ones we could imagine, but also how to really think of that, because I mean, I've made a piece with puppets in 2009 in Egypt, so it was, I would say, my third or fourth produced or funded piece, and it was more than 3/4 of the budget back then. And the person actually who designed the puppets didn't get paid. He was my mentor and he died this year. And so it was also a place where maybe if this person was healthy, and it was a few years ago, I would not have collaborated with Marius, and I would have very honestly worked with him. But at this point he was sick, and we had to look for someone else, and we had to look for someone else within a frame that could make it realistically work. So I don't think, in terms of the details of it, it's not like, okay, we want money from Pro Helvetia, how can we make it happen? But it was rather a very complex thought process which we all think of in making projects, in terms of having an exact vision and then seeing in a very Machiavelli way, how can we make it work within this existing world, within where we are, within the priorities we set for ourselves and our own ethical and integrity parameters.
Very well said.
Thanks for the question. I actually had a similar question in mind. And I think if one was to step back, there is the networks that artists move in are also part of, it's not as organic as we believe. But my question is, and it's a question I ask myself many times as somebody from India who's also part of this global art network, and looking at your collaboration, do you feel, and it's a question, it's not a comment, that, or an observation and a question, that if you look at the Swiss element in that, it's technical, there's a puppet, there's scenography or whatever, the European element, but the subjectivity of a South African or an Egyptian has to come out more contextual. Like, you know, the South African has to, is presenting a historical thing, but the Swiss element is more technical. Is that just, did that just happen? Or, because I encounter this quite a lot, you know, the burden of context and histories are very often, I would have to, I experience this in exhibitions, etc. We have to very often have the burden of representation or contextualization. Well, this is a South African, this is an Egyptian musical instrument. Is that a Swiss puppet? Maybe not. It's a question.
Ashkay, yeah.
I don't necessarily think my history is a burden. I think my history is a horror story. I think my history is enacted on my bodies in horrific ways. But I think that it has also made me who I am. And part of my joy is, I think, coming out of a context where it's not all easy. It's fucking difficult all the time. And I do think that that generates an energy and a meaning and a potential that's enormously important for me. I would hate to make work that was removed, or to ask myself to remove myself from my historic context. At the same time, I realize that then there's a sort of a bias in the, well, I'm not going to remove myself from my historic context, but Mr. Swiss person, you come remove yourself from your historic context. However, the contexts are linked. this play for me is interesting in Europe, and it's the first time I feel like actually I'm quite happy I'm taking this work to Europe, because it's a play that speaks about a bigger history. And I'm not just asking what is this about my body or me as a South African body, but asking what is the system that we have put on place that is a very old system that goes back to a colonial history, and how is that interacting on our bodies. So for me, it's a question that's very important to have in dialogue with Europeans. It's a very important, I don't think it makes any sense to just have it in dialogue here, and to have Europeans on the project was certainly interesting. And they're small in-jokes. Marius is from actually East Germany originally. And there's a line where I talk about the Eastern Europeans arriving with consumption in the country. And I'm always joking that I say that line to you, Marius. You're my Eastern European who arrived. So I think that our continents are our worlds are very linked by a profoundly violent history. I live in a country that has a profoundly violent history that people are currently trying to sweep under the carpet. The result of that is most people in the country are feeling terrible. People's bodies are falling apart, people's minds are falling apart, because we're not addressing that history. That history can't be addressed by black people, can't be addressed by white people. We all have to sit down and go, shit happened in this country, and what's our culpability, and what does this mean for us today? And I don't think that conversation can happen without Europe. And this play is very much a work about what is it that the biggest systems we put in place and the systems we're currently operating and are choosing to operate in are doing to our bodies.
But Ashka, is this your question, or was your question more about this division of labor from different places?
That could be one way of looking at it, but it's an observation that is not limited just to your production.
I think definitely, I mean, I remember also, for example, when I know, for example, for facts, I mean, our team is predominantly, and I proudly say, women. So Marius and Neo are the only men on the team currently. And it was very interesting. The women were very much connecting to the woman's voice, the more personal voice of Stacy. But I also remember when Marius saw the second draft, which was less Stacy's work alone, and where I came in with discussing how are we bringing context, because I didn't believe that what was inspiring for me and interesting about Stacy's story is Stacy's story in relation and in relation to context and bigger story, and in relation to the thousands of other people. And so when the second version came, Marius found it less personal, and it was, he honestly said, for example, it was less engaging for him. So these conversations do happen, whereas for me as an Egyptian, there was so much I could connect to in that context, and in that, and in the discussion about also politics and history and the view of that, and questions about privilege and so on. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this happens. There are, I mean, I don't want to speak about South Africa, but for example, for Egypt, it is complex to find a lighting designer who is as good, can communicate in English, and can carry the job also in Europe, and with the visa problems. I mean, this is a fact. So there's also discussions about the circles we move in terms of certain specializations. If we want to do the best work we want to do, or make a certain vision come to life, I become pragmatic in how can I make this happen? And then what are the possible avenues? And so I don't know if it's a coincidence, and I'm not saying necessarily that all lighting designers from Europe are better than lighting designers in Egypt, or I'm not saying that, but with a lot of given parameters in terms of certain technical work, and in terms of certain other frames, some things do just in that moment make more sense or make life easier.
Yeah, my question is, when we were invited by Matt to come here and discuss collaboration, I mean, what were your first thoughts? I mean, is it something that you find relevant to the discussion with us, or would you have preferred to discuss something else, or what were your just like initial thoughts about this?
Dominate, but I do have something. I really, for me, collaboration was enormously important on this project, enormously. So in a way, it was a very easy thing to talk about. I think it was, for me, probably the most important thing. There were lots of interesting things that we tried to question. It's a work that's a performance work, but I think the storytelling happens as much with the music and via the music as it does via the text. And I think that asking those kind of questions of, you know, we tend to see, because of how our brains are put together, that the text is the primary voice. I don't believe this project unfolded like that. So for me to talk about collaboration in this instance was enormously interesting and actually very much part of the process. It's been a process about finding friendships, about finding family. It was a difficult text for me to deal with, and doing it with people that I felt safe with and that I could trust and believed in was essential. So collaboration for me was at the very heart of this project, although I would never have framed it as collaboration. If you had said to me, you know, I bring out keywords about this project, collaboration wouldn't be my choice of words, because I always just think of it more as friendship or as creative working together or as community of artists. I'm a great believer in the community of artists. And I mean, also to say that, as Nancy's raising, and Nancy should speak about this as well, but it's not just a collaboration with the people you see up here. We talked to a lot of ghosts throughout this process and channeled a lot of other things. And yeah, maybe Nancy.
Okay, so I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but when I first got introduced on Skype to Stacy, and then I had to Google what is TB and what is it called in Arabic and what's that, and then I found out that my two favorite classical composers, they died when Giovanni Battista Pergolesi, he died when he was 28, and Lily Boulanger, of course, she died when she was 24, and I was like, wow.
And both of TB,
both had TB, and also part of the journey searching in the archive. Well, at the beginning, when they were sharing with me the story, miners got this disease from working in mines and everything. So, in the archive, in the ILAM International Library of African Music, they had this approach of let's see what was happening in mines and everything, and then I found this whole other world of music about the spirits that live in the chest and all the spirits, and it was for me like it's another world, and I need to also think as a musician why, for example, our Zor tradition in Egypt is very the reconciling with the spirits, why also the music industry doesn't have a space for that. And
Also to say about the Zor, for example, it's the main form of music that really is connected to the African influence of music, because it, or like historically, most of the people who worked in that profession were slaves. So there is historically. So there is that. So there is always. So that's what Nancy means about her curiosity about music in South Africa and so on, because of that interest in that form. I think for me I expected these questions also about funding and relationships and the constructs and so on, and I think how the project came with all of those different partners and collaborators from all of those different places was definitely for me to a great extent organic. There are certain things in the process that are much less organic and can be discussed much more about regulations or or boundaries of certain things, or questions that institutions ask, or our relationship with the institutions. But I don't know if that's the space for this discussion.
A short, difficult question, but on the question of the ethical approach to authorship, when you said, am I allowed, even though maybe the allowed is not the right way to say that. Just coming back, because I hear you saying you asked yourselves a lot of questions, but I don't hear you saying what your answer to it was. It would be nice to hear you formulate what your position eventually was.
The work is not enough answer?
On authorship specifically.
On your ethical questions, whether am I the
Allowed
right
to speak
person
the
to
story.
tell the story?
Okay, so if I'm, for example, making a cover of a song, I need to relate to it. And if I'm part of this, of course, I need to relate to it a lot more too. And like one of my favorite parts in the play is when Stacy's reading the side effects, because this I can totally relate to as a person. And I felt also like there is this, I don't know how to say it, but for example, Lily Boulanger, for example, she's someone who really suffered from something, and she made, for me, work that needs to be explained in many ways, but she doesn't have the space, and also how disease affected her and affected people in how they create things, and this was for me the gate to connecting to the piece and finding myself part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could have told the story alone. I don't think I think without Neo, without Nancy, without the other collaborators and the other voices, I don't think I would have wanted to tell the story. I think that I'll keep asking those questions. I think it's complex. I don't know if I've ever entirely resolved whether I can, and the question of what can one speak of. I can, in the end, only try to speak as honestly as I can. And I do think that asking the question around, I do think that within a South African context, asking the question around honestly and really digging into the question around what is white culpability and what is my historic culpability, because that culpability cannot, there's a habit in South Africa to say, yes, but I wasn't alive during apartheid, so I didn't do anything. But I've inherited wealth. And when I started digging into my personal history related to this, when I found out I had TB, I started doing all this research. It didn't start with this project. And then I'm going back to, hang on, but my ancestors were coming out here to the Eastern Cape. What is that story? And that all ended up informing the work. The story about my grandfather in the bar and my grandmother dancing on the Charleston on the table without panties for bananas during the influenza epidemic is a true story. That's a historic story of digging into my family archive. So once I started digging into this, there's like okay, you can say you've got a disease that you've caught by chance because you live in South Africa and it's one of the biggest diseases, one of the biggest killers. But actually, if you go back, there's a root to why you have this disease. It was brought by your ancestors to this continent. It was used productively by mining companies. So then those questions for me become not only difficult questions, can I speak of them, but questions I also have to speak of. And I think it's enormously important that those questions of what is a historic culpability, I wouldn't have the education I have if my parents hadn't profited of black people. I mean, that's the brute reality. I wouldn't have the life I have. I don't even have life if my parents hadn't profited of an apartheid system. My parents were never for the system, but they certainly didn't do anything to throw their wealth away that they benefited. They benefited enormously. I carry that benefit. What's my culpability? And how does that interact in my body? When I start feeling sick, is that not also something of the things that I'm carrying with me? And how do you deal with that, and how do you make something out of that? And for me, I was saying this to Leila, we had a big, one of our traumatic discussions, and I was going, one of the things I said is, ultimately, I don't know what to do about this shit. I came into this, you know, the old thing of like, oh, well, I was just born here. I didn't ask to be here. I don't know what to do about this shit except to say that I can try to make something out of it. I'm faced with a pile of shit, and all I can try to do is make something beautiful. And that's what we try to do.
I think just to get back to your answer, I think when I say it's the work, because the work for me is a current answer. So it's not a final answer. Maybe in 5 years, I'll look back and think, it was a very bad idea, it was very wrong, or I would look at it and think, this was not the approach that I would think was right in that moment, in retrospect. I think all we can do is offer artwork as only not a final thing, but a status of where we are in our intellect, emotions, life, and then we see.
Thanks very much. That was very important what you said. I'm very happy what we could hear on stage. We have to close this session, and we have to do this with a song. Mario's birthday is today, so can we all sing Happy Birthday? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Marius. Happy birthday to